So what does it all mean? Well, welcome into the main auditorium if you're just joining us, and thank you for sticking around for this next session, which is deliberately going back to the big picture, because we've got a sense, and that was a real first-class sense, wasn't it, of what can be done. But if you're in the business of advising startups, what does it mean? How do you end up building a startup in 2025 and for the next few years that's somehow resilient to AI? And by the way, how do you even start out on that path when you've got multi-billion-dollar companies in the mix that you could be competing with potentially? How do you avoid just being in a race to the bottom on price? How do you think differently about all of this? Well, that in part is what our next guest is here to help us think about, not to give us all of the answers, but to help us start asking some of the questions. So let's welcome to the stage somebody who is several things: an entrepreneur, that is for sure, an advisor to some incredible startups, including Grok, the US AI company that needs very little introduction, a former CTO of Grok, I might add. Someone who spends their time now advising startups, governments, venture capital firms around the world. So helping us think back to that big picture, to help us join the dots. So an advisor, a self-described humanist, but to their boots an entrepreneur, to help us think. Please welcome to the stage Dinesh Maheshwari. Good morning. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, Ollie, for the introduction. Good morning, folks. Glad to be here. Today we are going to talk about, as Ollie mentioned, how to create startups that are resilient, that are not only resilient, but also enable value, not just cost and productivity value, but value that enables better quality of living. And while doing so, not just survive, but thrive, while avoiding the fate of many startups when they end up competing directly with the big behemoths. And I've coined the term Walmart effect for that. And that is important not just for the economics, but also for the dignity of the local societies, for enabling thriving local societies, for enabling some agency in different locales all around the world, and not be, quote unquote, enslaved to the technology that is being pushed to them. I initially had 10 minutes scheduled for this talk, but now that I have 15, I'm going to do an extemporaneous discourse as well, and would like to lay down the context, which I believe is important, in which there are more opportunities that we can enable for the startups than what is being talked about. Flew in yesterday night from Silicon Valley, 3 hours of sleep, so bear with me if my diction is a bit slow. Walmart effect. Let me go back. The emphasis you'll find is on how to enable opportunities in the local community context, and an opportunity that actually the big gorillas cannot serve. Walmart as a term, quote unquote, that I'm using, captures all the big gorillas: Walmart in the consumer space, Microsoft in the enterprise application space, Ford on the automotive space. When it comes to foundation models, it's OpenAI, Anthropic, so on and so forth. We know that the big gorillas, the big companies, have a lot of momentum behind them. They have quite a bit of cash flow that they can leverage. talking about enabling automation, enabling improving productivity in the context of, say, Microsoft Office applications. There are numerous gatherings that I have participated in where the conversation is about how to improve productivity in various applications for these enterprises, small or large enterprises. And the one common aspect there is that these applications are adjacent to where Microsoft enterprise software already exists. Microsoft will not leave that space to anyone else, and they have the size and the momentum to do so. Most of these startups trying to enable improved productivity in that space, unfortunately, will be made irrelevant when Microsoft itself absorbs those machine learning technologies, which they already are. What space then is left for these startups? What is it that Microsoft cannot do? What is it that Walmart cannot do? And given that the big gorillas need a lot of fodder, and for that they need to scale, they identify commonalities across societies and enable quote-unquote value on those commonalities. And that is what creates, allows them to reduce their fixed costs while enabling value for these societies on those common aspects. That is also the opportunity that the startups have, is to enable what the local societies would need, the local startups would need, the local SMBs, small and medium businesses would need. A little bit about myself. Ollie already introduced me as advising startups, 10 startups where I led different aspects, most recently CTO of Grok, 3 of my own, advised 30 startups, advised governments as well, mostly on the deep tech, but now I advise also on the applied tech side, because there's a need to do so. Walmart effect, to me, is the homogenization of the product offerings that occurs when the big behemoths try to scale. That, as I said earlier, is what creates the opportunity for the startups to serve the custom needs in the local societies. That is a space that the big gorillas would not be able to serve well. Now, that is also the space, interestingly, that has enabled big transitions in the past. Amazon's success over the brick and mortar companies was not because it could offer lower prices. It was because it could offer more diversity in products than the brick and mortar shops could. And in doing so, it enabled that value for the society. The customer still had a set of offerings from Amazon, still has a set of offerings from Amazon that they have to choose from. Now imagine that the service provider actually customizes it for the end customer, whether that's an enterprise or whether it's an individual. That customization requires an understanding of the local environment. It is not something that the big enterprises can support with the overhead that they have. The opportunities on the local environments, some examples, the culturally different aspects that would require the marketing and the advertisement to be targeted a very specific way. The weather nuances and what it means for the local community. The lifestyle. New York is very different from San Francisco, and San Francisco is very different from Delhi. But it's not just about the big cities. It is more importantly about the small cities, where the lifestyle, say in small city like, and Cincinnati is a small city compared to San Francisco, very different and not being served well. As I've been visiting Cincinnati for some time, not being served well by the big tech companies. I've listed some of the things that are very specific to the local environments. I would encourage the startup founders and the entrepreneurs to look at what are the nuances that they can avail of to serve the uniqueness that is very specific to their societies. And the time for serving that uniqueness is now, because we finally have the AI tools that can enable that customization. Amazon serves a large number of products, but it is still not customized to the end individual or the end entity. AI can enable one to do that. I'm not going to talk about the building blocks of the technology for that. There's a lot of material about it. It is largely in the category of natural language processing. LLMs are one manifestation of that. We all know about what LLMs can do, being able to do predictive analytics on top of that, and multimodal models that actually serve different needs. That would be the technology base that already exists. There is no point reinventing that. By the way, what I would like to provoke through this conversation, you probably have noticed that this is unlike any other talk which is not talking about technology. It is more of a conversation to provoke the entrepreneurs, the VCs, and the government agencies to think about how to look at enabling startups in their own locales. There is no, if one has deep enough pockets and one would still like to compete with the big behemoths, yes, one should take a shot at going against the Walmarts in the various categories, but otherwise there is no need to do so. The time is very similar to what happened during the initial days of the automobiles, when the internal combustion engine was invented. Everyone was playing with it. There were many automobile houses that would create their own version of it. We are currently at the single-stroke engine in the internal combustion engine equivalent of AI. It takes a lot of money and effort to go from a single-stroke engine to a 4-cylinder and a V8. However, if one views that as a black box and looks at what applications can be enabled to enable that value, and that's what happened with the automotives. Replacing the horse-driven carriage with the automotive is what really enabled moving the goods from one city to another city, that enabled increase the SAM for the manufacturers, and that created the centers of excellence. That was the big transition that happened. So if we can guide, and this is the call for the VCs, the government policymakers, and the entrepreneurs themselves, instead of trying to come up with their own one-stroke engine, look at how we can enable the applications of the automobile. That is where the value to the society is. That is where the resilience is. If you see that as a black box, you will adopt the two-stroke, the four-stroke, the V8 when it comes out. But if you know what problem and value you're enabling for the society, that remains. So these foundational technology building blocks do not have to be reinvented by everyone. People who are playing into it, as what happened during the automobile days, there will be consolidation. But the value enablement on how it gets used for the local economies, that is where the most value is for enabling, I'm using the term value several times in the statement, but enabling value for the for also improving the quality of life. By the way, the other thing that was happening around the automotive days was the airplane. But that took way longer to manifest value for the society, because it was being tinkered with for quite some time at the level of, and it was an enthusiast project. There were efforts that were not guided properly. It was used in the warfare for some time, and that too in the beginning it wasn't. Only midway in the First World War was it used. The point is, it needs guidance from VCs, from the policymakers in the governments, and a context for the entrepreneurs to enable that value. I was in the back room listening to the previous panel discussion, and one of the aspects that often gets discussed is the productivity improvement and the cost reductions. And what I would encourage the entrepreneurs, the VCs, and the policymakers to look at is beyond that. What does it do to enable the local restaurants, the local service providers, the local traffic patterns, and how can AI be used to customize that? So if previous slide was depicting at a very high abstraction level the building blocks that would go in, this slide is at this abstraction level, pretty high still, is how that would work. Get local data, fine-tune the existing models, address the biases, and deploy for enabling the local needs. As you can see, that this requires someone who knows the local environment, a startup, a small, medium business in a locality that knows the nuances would be able to customize it for the local small businesses themselves. I think by now you have been repeating it a few times. While there is a lot of buzz about the AI progress on the fundamental models, on now reasoning models, on the platforms that enable the use of these models, and most of it is being driven by big entities. The immediate space around it will also be taken by the big entities, but there is a space adjacent to the local communities where one can build on top of those platforms with the local nuances that will not be touched by the big behemoths, because it is they're not structured to do so. It is cost prohibitive for them to do that, and it does not bring in enough revenue to justify the first few steps. That itself is the opportunity for the startups, the local startups, that would enable the local economy that I see is important to bring back the dignity to the local spaces. I will leave it at that. I would love to discuss with anyone who is interested and provoke more discussions. I'll be available for the rest of the day in the back room and around the conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Dinesh. Thank you very much indeed. Let's